Your average person knows basically no history, and even most history buffs are normally clustered on a handful of topics like World War II or the Roman Empire. The sad thing here is that a lot of truly incredible events just end up falling through the cracks. Across history, there have been countless absolutely incredible wars with great battles that determined history, but they've been forgotten. This is a video to honor those. These are 12 incredible wars across history that you've probably never heard of. My main criteria for this is combining the historical impact of the war with how big it was and how generally interesting it is. For obscurity, I'm trying to gear this for a low-level history buff, but there are plenty of wars here that even hardcore history buffs have almost never heard of. This is in no particular order, so let's get started. Hi, I'm Rudyard, the guy behind What If Alt Hist, and wars are expensive. I mean, so many wars across history were lost due to bad financial management. And this is where our sponsor Truebill comes in. Truebill's an all-in-one personal finance platform that lets you save more and spend less. The Personal Finance Manager allows you to manage subscriptions, lower bills, monitor your credit score, build your savings, all in one place. I know sometimes I forget about certain subscriptions or bills that seem to pop up on me, and having Truebill to keep me aware and informed about where my money's going can be a lifesaver. They have a great system for canceling subscriptions and budgeting, which I use to keep myself informed of my spending and keep me aware of where my money's going. The budgeting's simple and comprehensive, with alerts to notify me for when I'm over my budget and ordering my spending by category. If you want to avoid ending up like Louis XIV and having your nation or household fall apart due to badly managed money, get Truebill now so you can deal with whatever life throws at you. And to get started at Truebill for free, click the link in the description or head to truebill.com/whatifalthist. Number 1. The Taiping Rebellion. This is the third bloodiest war in history. We think it killed about 30 million people, or nearly double World War I. That's not even the craziest thing. This was a war fought by a man who thought he was the second coming of Christ that led a communist revolution. Wait, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, how have I never heard of this? Mid-19th century China was a mess. The country was so intensely overpopulated that most people were only barely getting by, while at the same time, the country had fallen technologically behind the West, and China had just faced a humiliating defeat to the British in the Opium Wars. Enter Hong Shuquan, a South Chinese peasant who, after meeting with an American missionary from Kentucky, had dreams where he believed himself to be the second son of Christ, destined to form a new religion and liberate China from its Manchu barbarian overlords. He was able to muster an army of peasants and bandits that marched across south-central China, seizing the city of Nanjing to form a new heavenly kingdom that was built on gender equality, free love, and communism. The Taipings ran out of initiative in a northern campaign when they tried to seize the imperial capital of Beijing, and the government's Mongol horse-archer cavalry and the winter weather wiped out their army. The rest of the war was basically a bloody multi-year slog as the imperial forces tried to grind down the Taiping rebels. Some highlights of the war was that an imperial commander called Zheng Guofan was sent to his home province of Hunan to fight off the Taiping rebellions, and then built an army that defeated the Taipings literally from just talking to neighbors and getting friends of friends to join. The Imperials also had a white, largely American and British mercenary force that were the spear tip of their army, and by the time the Taiping capital was seized, Hong Shuquan had gone totally insane, pretending that no war was secretly going on outside, almost like Ba Sing Se in The Last Airbender, putting out religious edicts and smoking opium in his massive harem. Number 2. Demetrius' invasion of India. Now, this is a war you almost never hear about. You see, India didn't have historical records before around 1000 AD when the Muslims invaded, so you could technically have an Indian Genghis Khan that we would have never heard of. However, long story short, after the fall of Alexander the Great's empire, a Greek colonial state developed in modern Afghanistan that later spread into Pakistan. Very surprisingly, this kingdom converted to Buddhism. We can piece together that a great conqueror from this Greek-Afghan kingdom conquered across the whole north of India in the 2nd century BC. His armies reached nearly to the edge of Bangladesh before he died, which would have made him one of the great conquerors in Indian and possibly all of world history. However, since records are so poor, that's all we know. Number 3. The An Lushan Rebellion. Of the 10 bloodiest wars in history, 8 were fought predominantly in China. I had to cut a lot of Chinese wars from this list since I think a lot of them have very little impact outside China, and Western audiences wouldn't find them interesting, but this really deserves a place here. In the 8th century, China was the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the world. The Tang dynasty controlled a giant empire that stretched deep into Central Asia, largely by co-opting Central Asian peoples into their empire to do the fighting. This resulted in a balance of power between the Central Asian military commanders and the civilian Han Chinese government. Here comes An Lushan, a commander from modern-day Uzbekistan. He was a general in the Chinese army on China's northeastern frontier with the Mongols. An was ambitious and had built up an alliance structure with other commanders, and the emperor felt threatened by this and tried to have him fired, which just resulted in An rebelling, burning the Chinese capital down and killing the emperor. There are a couple of funny side notes in the story, with one being that An was morbidly obese, but the rumor was that he was having an affair with the emperor's favorite concubine, who was considered one of the most beautiful women of her time, where she would dress him up as a baby. The imperial forces were able to assassinate An after he took the capital, but he was so fat the knife wasn't able to cut through his fat, making his death long and protracted. After An's death, both his and the emperor's sons kept the war going. The war went on for years, racking up an unimaginable death toll of over 20 million, which is over 5 million more than World War I. And remember, this is the early Middle Ages when China had a population somewhere in the range of 70 million. The An Lushan rebellion thus was a big inflection point in all of Chinese history, where the system of building empires based off alliances with Central Asian tribes just stopped working. The bureaucrats gained total power over society, Buddhism lost it to Confucianism, and every ethnic Han regime afterwards was isolationist. Number 4. The Second Congo War. This war is technically still happening, and horrifyingly it's the bloodiest war since World War II. In the 1990s, Central Africa was experiencing acute overpopulation. This meant that the genocide in Rwanda resulted in people fleeing to related tribes in the Congo, which, through cascading effects, resulted in the Democratic Republic of Congo collapsing as a sort of functioning nation. Rwandan-based Tutsi rebels attacked west across their country, making their way against the government forces to the outskirts of the capital Kinshasa, which is legitimately impressive considering the Congo is the size of Western Europe. This is called Africa's World War, since countless countries, including Sudan and Angola, got involved in order to get in on the action or protect their borders. This war was so horrifying that it saw the collapse of society and sort of stable government to be replaced by a Mad Max package of warlords, slavery, child soldiers, genocide against pygmies, and stuff like that. Armies would wander the countryside raping, pillaging, and feeding off the local population. A reason the warlords could keep fighting for so long was that they were in fact supplying the coltan that goes into our smartphones during the computer revolution. The hated leader of the government forces died while the government forces started to beat the Rwandan rebels, which resulted in peace talks in 2002. Some warlords are still independent even today, however, and so the remnants of the war continues. Number 5. The Imjin War. Japan in the late 16th century was the main country in Asia that was able to technologically adapt to the West. The Japanese had implemented Western-style muskets, formations, and the like alongside their naturally incredible samurai to form what was probably the best army in the world at the time. Japan had also just finished their civil war and was burning with energy as their shogun, or basically military dictator, Hideyoshi, planned an attack on Korea that would hopefully become the springboard for a conquest of China and all of East Asia. The Japanese invaded Korea and had a quick series of victories, seizing control of much of the country rapidly. However, the tide of war was turned literally and figuratively by probably one of the greatest military commanders of all time, Yi Sun-sin. Yi won the Battle of Mianyongyang Strait, God, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in which his 13 ships were able to wipe out 330 Japanese ships. And some of those brilliant tactical moves in history, the Koreans got the Japanese fleet stuck in a tidal pool in which they rammed into each other. This was a veritable Salamis of the Orient, in which the Japanese naval defeats meant they had trouble supplying their army. An interesting side note is that the Koreans had these precursors to ironclads called turtle boats that they would fight the Japanese with. As the war dragged on for years, the Chinese, who were the vassal overlords of the Koreans, were able to reinforce the Korean peninsula, thus meaning the Japanese were unable to conquer Korea. This defeat, compounded by the death of the Japanese commander Hideyoshi, meant that Japan stopped expansionism. Tokugawa seized power and turned Japan inwards and rejected Western technology for centuries, thus stalling the rise of the Japanese Empire by centuries. Number 6. The War of the Triple Alliance. For every Napoleon, Alexander, or Genghis Khan, there are like 5 wannabes. Saddam Hussein's, Napoleon III's, or Gaddafi's. However, the figure who takes the cake for the most delusional attempt at world conquest is a certain Francisco Solano Lopez, dictator of 19th century Paraguay. He believed himself to be the South American Napoleon and was supporting a side in the Uruguayan Civil War. When that side lost, he decided to save them, but the little problem was that Paraguay was hundreds of miles from Uruguay, divided between it by Argentina and Brazil, countries that together have 27 times Paraguay's population. However, he did start that war with the triple alliance of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay forming against Little Paraguay. The Paraguayan military was far better than the others and actually made some admirable conquests before they were inevitably forced on the defensive. This war was absolutely brutal for Paraguay, so much so that practically every male in the country fought. 70% of its male population died, with Solano Lopez wandering around the capital, pistol in hand, ordering any man he saw to fight in the front. Rumor has it polygamy took root in Paraguay afterwards to make up for the lack of men. Number 7. The Great Northern War. By God, the comparison of this war to the last one is so jarring. Geopolitically, the year 1700 was a weird place. It was a world where Germany was a chessboard that other countries fought over, and Russia was a medieval backwater, while Poland controlled most of Eastern Europe, and the Swedes were the dominant military power. Sweden had been ruled by military geniuses for the last 50 or so years, and had a sort of military hegemony over the region. When the king of Sweden died, he was replaced by a 16-year-old boy. In a drunken brawl, the kings of Denmark and Russia, later teaming up with Poland, Lithuania, and Saxony, agreed this was the time to take Sweden on and unseat its dominance. However, little did they know that the boy king of Sweden, Charles XII, just happened to be one of the greatest geniuses in military history. Charles, in a series of brilliant campaigns, defeated the Russians, Danes, Polish, and Saxon forces, seizing control of all of Scandinavia and most of Eastern Europe. Considering Sweden had such a small population compared to its opponents, it was normal to fight battles severely outnumbered. He then built up a massive army and launched an invasion of Russia. Charles XII had gotten an agreement from Cossack warlords that if he invaded Ukraine, he'd get their support and supplies, and so launched an invasion of Ukraine, where he met the Russian armies led by Peter the Great outside Kiev at the Battle of Poltava. You see, Peter the Great is probably the greatest leader in Russian history, and he effectively turned it from a backwards medieval country into a modern superpower, overhauling their bureaucracy, military, intellectual, and popular culture onto Western standards. Thus, when Charles XII charged the Russian line at Poltava, he expected it to crumble like the peasant mobs he had faced a few years before at Narva, but the newly modernized Russian army crushed the Swedes, effectively winning the war in that battle. Charles XII fled south, where his allies the Ottomans imprisoned him for years. Meanwhile, the Swedes lost their empire and territory, so much so that it was really the last time the Swedes ever had an empire or even tried to. Long after the war, Charles XII was finally released by the Turks, and upon reaching Sweden, invaded Norway so that he could invade the British Isles, but died outside of Trondheim, thus passing a man who was practically the reincarnation of Alexander the Great. Number 8. The Fall of Assyria. Okay, to be fair, this is kind of cheating in that this was a bunch of wars over a several-decade period as the Assyrian Empire went from the greatest empire up to that point to a pile of rubble. However, it's been nearly 3,000 years since then, and there are so many epic wars that few of you have probably never heard of that I feel justified in doing this. Assyria in the 8th and 7th centuries BC was the most powerful country in the world in history. It controlled the whole Fertile Crescent region from Iran to Egypt. The Assyrian military was on the cutting edge of technology and was able to brutally crush any rebels. However, the Assyrians, like the later Germans in the 20th century, compensated for their wonderful military by horrible public relations that sparked widespread hatred. You start to see the decline of the Assyrian Empire with their failed invasion of Armenia, in which the Armenians drove them into the mountains in the winter as the Assyrian army froze to death. Afterwards, the Assyrians only barely fought off invasions from the Sumerian and Scythian peoples from Ukraine, which broke upon the civilized world. This was the Iron Age equivalent of fighting off the Huns or Mongols, both of which nearly destroyed civilization in the region. However, all of these bloody wars meant that Assyria was bleeding its own population white, while also the trajectory of empire was taking place in which the rich got much richer and the poor lost their properties, becoming debt slaves or urban proletariat. The Assyrian military became majority non-Assyrian, which is a bad combination for a nation that's widely hated. The Assyrians started to face constant rebellions from Egypt and Babylon, both nations that had histories of over 2,000 years at that point, and proud cultures. It's kind of ludicrous, without Pitbull or Tayo Cruz, that in Egypt and Babylon, literally the same guys did the rebelling. Like Necho in Egypt, and I forget the Babylonian guy's name, would rebel, have their rebellions crushed, and then flee into the swamps only to emerge a couple of years later to rebel again. Something that makes this even more impressive is that the Assyrians were absolutely brutal to defeated rebels. They literally made propaganda pieces about flaying the skins of defeated peoples or forcing fathers to mash the bones of their children. However, Assyria was so hated that the people kept on rebelling. Eventually, Assyria just ran out of steam, and a combined Babylonian and Egyptian rebellion, allied with the nomadic Median tribes, crushed them and destroyed their capital city of Nineveh. Nineveh, perhaps the largest city in the world at the time, was literally eviscerated off the face of the planet. The glass literally melted in the city. When a Greek army marched past the ruins of Nineveh 150 years later, the local inhabitants, the descendants of the Assyrians, had no idea who built the ruins. There's a kind of twisted poetry that goes from being the greatest empire to forgotten so quickly. 9. The Byzantine-Sasanian War. For 700 years, the Middle East was divided between a Greek-speaking Roman western half and a Persian-speaking eastern half. There was a permanently cold and sometimes pretty hot war between the Persians and Romans. One of the best and most epic examples of this was in the 7th century. The Byzantine Empire fell in a civil war, and the Persians took the opportunity to launch a lightning strike against the Middle East, seizing the Byzantine positions in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, effectively conquering further than any Persian empire in nearly 1,000 years. The Persians allied with the Avar Confederacy, based out of modern Hungary, and attacked the empire from the Balkans. Both coordinated attacks, pressing towards the capital of Constantinople. The Byzantines in fact considered leaving Constantinople and fleeing to a new capital in Carthage in modern Tunisia. However, the Byzantines had an incredible emperor as their leader, Heraclius. Heraclius took his army by boat to northeastern Turkey and attacked the northern Persian Empire through Armenia, while the Persians were in turn bearing down the Byzantine capital. This made the Persians launch a coordinated siege of Constantinople with the Avars, with one sieging the European side and the other the Asian side, which was defeated by the Byzantines. The Byzantines then formed an alliance with the Turkic peoples of the Caucasus and attacked south into Iraq, nearly seizing the Persian capital of Ctesiphon before the Persians sued for peace. This war devastated the whole region, making the Romans and Persians both exhausted. Also, you've got to keep in mind, only a little bit before, half of the region's population had been killed by an earlier version of the Black Death. In effect, this war set up the region for the meteoric rise of the Islamic Caliphate that took place 50 years later. Number 10. The War of Spanish Succession. France was the beating heart of Europe in the early 18th century. The European elite spoke French and tried to imitate French culture in every way. French philosophy was universally respected, while the French military was probably the best in the world and very nearly conquered Europe. The King of France was a certain Louis XIV, who I think is one of the most overrated kings in history, and his reign was marked by countless wars of expansion, so many that my sobriety test while drinking is to see if I can remember them in order. However, they all universally failed as the European system continually teamed up against the overpowered France. The Spanish Empire by this time was a walking corpse, but one that still covered every discovered continent. The King of Spain was called Charles the Hexed, or Cursed, which is a perfect example of why inbreeding's bad. He was mentally stuck at the age of 6, autistic, a hunchback with an overbite that meant he could barely chew, and would randomly ejaculate. Since that last thing meant he couldn't have heirs, the crowns of Europe had already pre-divided up the massive Spanish Empire for after he would eventually die. However, out of bitterness, he just gave the whole thing to France. Adding the vast Spanish Empire to the already overpowered France seemed like a reasonable recipe for Roman Empire 2.0, and the rest of Europe was not happy. The Dutch, Austrians, most of Germany, and the British allied against the French. The French launched an attack into southern Germany to knock out Austria, which was already struggling to fight off a Hungarian rebellion. However, Britain just happened to have one of their greatest commanders of all time, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, direct ancestor of Winston Churchill. Marlborough was able to trick the Dutch and bring his British army hundreds of miles from their bases into southern Germany to stop the French from wiping out the Austrians. He met the French at the Battle of Blenheim and trounced them. This was an era where fortresses were really powerful, which gave the defense a lot of advantages, and the rest of the war was basically an exercise in masochism, as both sides waged long sieges, and the French very gradually lost the war. The Austrians, meanwhile, invaded Spain, effectively showing how washed up the former superpower was. Number 11. The rise of the Mauryan Empire. The funny thing is, not a single Indian record mentions Alexander the Great. It's kind of like how the Bible never mentions the pyramids. Which, I mean, relates back to what I said about Demetrius, is that they didn't really write down history before 1000 AD. However, the fall of Alexander's empire had profound effects on Indian history. As Alexander's armies left back over the mountains, leaving chaos in their wake, it created lots of opportunities for enterprising young men. Those opportunities were taken by Kautila and Chandragupta. Kautila was a professor of politics and statecraft at the most prestigious Indian university at the time of Taxila, very much like an Indian Sun Tzu or Machiavelli. He met up with a wandering, dispossessed son of a chieftain who impressed him named Chandragupta. The two of them went into the woods that made up a large part of western India at the time, and formed an army out of brigands. Combining Kautila's strategic genius and Chandragupta's leadership meant that their haphazard army was able to take over all of India, even though much of his control was indirect and loose, especially in the south. This was no easy task, and that the armies of the established states they fought, like the Magadhan Empire, had armies numbering the tens of thousands with elephants and chariots. He also fought with the Seleucid or Greek-descendant empire that ruled the Middle East, driving them from modern Pakistan and Afghanistan. Chandragupta and his descendants then went about forming the Mauryan Empire, which is India's answer to the Roman Empire, and Kautila became the dominant Indian political philosopher, so much that he intellectually practically dominated the field until the British colonization. Number 12. The 30 Years' War. I kind of hesitated putting this war on this list given it's the most normie, but I think it deserves the place. 17th century Europe was suffering from a secular crisis like we have now, with sky-high inequality, depressed standard of living, political polarization, corruption, and social collapse. However, rather than right and left being the main dividing factor splitting the European continent, instead it was religion, which cut through nations, classes, and families between the Protestants and Catholics. Germany was not a unified country, but was a patchwork of tiny principalities, church territories, and city-states held together under the loose leadership of the Catholic Habsburg Holy Roman Emperors based out of Austria. The way the title of emperor was chosen was that there was an electoral system where different regions had different votes, and the Catholics held a loose majority and just happened to always vote in the Catholic Habsburgs. However, what happened was that Bohemia, or modern Czechia, a majority Protestant area, got a Protestant ruling family. If that political decision went through, it would result in the Protestants gaining a majority, meaning the Habsburgs would lose power. The Austrian Habsburgs, who were sharing power with the Spanish Habsburgs, the world's superpower with colonies everywhere, launched an invasion of Bohemia, wiping out the Protestant forces at the Battle of White Mountain. Protestant Denmark, which was widely viewed as the power of the future, then declared war on the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs had the wonderful leadership of Wallenstein, who was like the literal definition of the military-industrial complex that utterly destroyed the Danes, even militarily occupying Denmark. The French, who, although were Catholic, were rivals of the Habsburgs, then paid Sweden to invade Germany to defeat the Habsburgs. The Swedes were led by the brilliant commander Gustavus Adolphus, who had been modernizing Sweden's military to make it the best in the world. He destroyed the Catholic armies at Breitenfeld and Lutzen, heavily outnumbered, and his forces even reached Austria. It looked like he might seize Vienna, thus resulting in the Swedes conquering Central Europe, but he died at the Battle of Lutzen. The war then degraded into a bunch of nasty small campaigns. I mean, it's called the 30 Years' War for a reason. I can't overstate how brutal this war was, in that no one's supply chains were very good, and the strategy was to bleed the enemy's economy dry, mostly by stealing from their population and raping a lot of peasants. A third of Germany's population, in some areas over 70% of the population, died, putting Germany in a 100-year recession. I've heard a really good argument from some people that Germany's character as a modern nation was formed by how traumatic the 30 Years' War was. As the war dragged on, the French worried that the Habsburgs were doing too well, and under the leadership of their Cardinal Richelieu, one of the craftiest statesmen in history, joined into the conflict. Based out of Belgium, which was a colony of theirs, the Spanish invaded northern France, nearly seizing Paris before being turned back at the Battle of Rocroi. The war kind of ran out of steam, since none of the participants really had functioning societies anymore. Spain and France had collapsed into civil wars, Italy was in rebellion, Sweden had just run out of guys, and the Netherlands in their classic Dutch way had somehow made a massive profit off the war. The Treaty of Westphalia that came at the end of 30 Years of War is considered one of the turning points in European history, since everyone sat down to prevent another war like this from ever happening again. A complex balance of power developed, and Europe settled into 150 years of social stability, relative peace, and humanity called the L'Ancien Régime. Similarly, the 30 Years' War left a bad taste in everyone's mouth when it came to religious war and religious fanaticism, which set Western civilization up for the Enlightenment and secularism in general. Well, those were my 12 wars. What did you think? What war interested you the most, and which wars would you have put on the list? Comment that. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, I'm launching with 2 different tech companies run by 2 of my best friends in the next 2 weeks, Pearl and Pillar, both of which are for the creator space and really awesome, the links of which are in the description. Also, you can check out my Patreon where I've got the first couple hundred pages of my cultural history of America and history of the world. Alternatively, just check out my social media. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.